Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In March 1989, spring break was in full swing on South Padre Island, Texas. College students were crossing the border into Mexico, seeking adventure in the vibrant nightlife of Matamoros. Among them was 21-year-old Mark Kilroy, a promising pre-med student with his whole life ahead of him. But what began as a typical spring break celebration would unveil a horrifying underground world of drug trafficking, occult practices, and human sacrifice. When Mark vanished outside a popular bar, no one could have imagined the dark forces that had claimed him, or the shocking investigation that would expose a murderous cult operating just miles from the American border. Tonight, we dive into one of the most disturbing cross-border investigations in history, and the case that changed spring break forever. Spring break 1989 started like any other for Mark Kilroy, a pre-med student at the University of Texas. The 21-year-old junior had planned the trip with his friends, looking forward to the warm beaches of South Padre Island, Texas, and the vibrant nightlife across the border in Matamoros, Mexico. Mark was the all-American college student, tall, athletic, and intelligent, with a promising future ahead of him in medicine. His parents, Helen and Jim Kilroy, had raised him in Santa Fe, Texas, instilling strong values and a sense of responsibility that made him stand out among his peers. On March 14, 1989, Mark and his friends spent the day on South Padre Island, joining thousands of other college students enjoying their spring break. As evening approached, they decided to cross the border into Matamoros, a common destination for spring breakers seeking to experience Mexico's more lenient drinking age laws and bustling nightlife. The border crossing was routine, and the group made their way into the city, visiting various clubs and bars along Matamoros's main strip. The night progressed without incident until the early hours of March 15th. At approximately 2 a.m., Mark became separated from his friends outside a popular bar called Garcia's. His companions weren't initially worried. It was common for groups to split up and reconnect later. But when Mark failed to return to their hotel room that night, concern began to grow. The next morning, Mark's friends retraced their steps and searched the areas they'd visited the previous night. When there was still no sign of him, they contacted local authorities and the U.S. consulate. Jim and Helen Kilroy were notified of their son's disappearance, and they immediately flew to Texas to assist in the search. What followed was one of the most extensive cross-border searches in the region's history. The Kilroys, refusing to sit idle, launched a massive campaign to find their son. They printed and distributed thousands of flyers bearing Mark's image, offered a substantial reward for information, and worked tirelessly with both American and Mexican authorities to coordinate search efforts. But what no one knew at the time was that Mark's fate had already been sealed in a way that would shock both nations and expose a dark underworld operating just miles from the American border. The investigation took a significant turn when Mexican federal police received tips about drug-related activities at Rancho Santa Elena, a property located about 20 miles west of Matamoros. The ranch belonged to a family with suspected ties to drug trafficking, but what investigators would discover there went far beyond typical cartel operations. On April 1, 1989, Mexican federal agents conducted a raid on the ranch. They were initially looking for evidence of drug trafficking, but what they found would herald the beginning of an investigation that would reveal practices so disturbing that many veteran law enforcement officers would later say they wished they could forget what they saw. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came when agents discovered suspicious religious artifacts scattered around the property. There were candles, ritualistic items, and crude altars that seemed to blend elements of Santeria, Palo Mayombe, and other occult practices. But it was what they found buried in the soil that would turn this drug raid into something far more sinister. As agents began searching the grounds more thoroughly, they discovered freshly disturbed earth. Upon digging, they uncovered human remains. The first body was not Mark Kilroy's, but rather that of another victim who had fallen prey to what would soon be revealed as a cult operating under the leadership of Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo, a Cuban-American who had convinced his followers that human sacrifice would make them invisible to law enforcement and bulletproof in gunfights. The investigation quickly expanded, with more law enforcement personnel brought in to process what was rapidly becoming one of the largest crime scenes in Mexican history. As they continued to dig, more bodies were discovered. Each victim showed signs of ritual murder, evidence of torture, mutilation, and specific patterns of dismemberment that suggested these weren't random killings, but rather part of an organized system of human sacrifice. The breakthrough in Mark Kilroy's case came when investigators found a human brain in a black cauldron near one of the ritual sites. Forensic analysis would later confirm it belonged to Mark. Further excavation revealed more of his remains, along with evidence of the horrific final hours of his life. According to subsequent confessions from cult members, Mark had been specifically targeted because he was a young, healthy American student. Constanzo believed that sacrificing such a victim would provide especially powerful protection for his drug trafficking operations. Mark had been held captive for several hours before being killed, subjected to torture, and ultimately murdered as part of a ritual that involved removing parts of his brain and spine while he was still alive. The cult, which called themselves Los Narcosatánicos, the Narco-Satanists, had been operating in the area for months, combining drug trafficking with their twisted religious practices. They believed their rituals granted them supernatural protection for their criminal activities, and they had killed numerous people before Mark Kilroy became their victim. As investigators pieced together the evidence, they began to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just a drug operation that had killed a few people. This was an organized group that had merged drug trafficking with occult practices in a way that had never been seen before in the region. The cult had developed their own twisted theology, combining elements of various religions and beliefs into a deadly cocktail that justified murder as a means of gaining spiritual power. The investigation revealed that Constanzo had built his following through a combination of charisma, fear, and promises of supernatural protection. He had started as a practitioner of Palo Mayombe in Miami and Mexico City, gradually gathering followers and becoming increasingly violent in his practices. By the time he established his operation in Matamoros, he had convinced his core group of followers that human sacrifice was necessary for their protection and success. The search for the cult members became one of the largest manhunts in Mexican history. Law enforcement on both sides of the border worked together, sharing information and resources in an effort to bring the killers to justice. The case had become more than just the search for Mark Kilroy's murderers. It had exposed a criminal enterprise that combined modern drug trafficking with ancient practices in a way that shocked even experienced narcotics investigators. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about how Mark had spent his final hours. Security camera footage from various locations in Matamoros showed him walking with his friends earlier in the evening, appearing relaxed and happy. The last confirmed sighting of him alive was outside Garcia's bar, where witnesses reported seeing him speaking with two men. These men would later be identified as cult members who had been specifically tasked with finding victims for their rituals. The horror of what happened to Mark Kilroy, combined with the discovery of other victims at the ranch, created an international media sensation. Reporters from around the world descended on Matamoros, trying to make sense of a crime that seemed to belong more in a horror movie than in reality. The case would eventually lead to significant changes in how law enforcement approached cross-border investigations and highlighted the dangers that could lurk in what appeared to be routine drug trafficking operations. The manhunt for Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo and his followers intensified as more details of their crimes emerged. Law enforcement agencies discovered that the cult's influence extended far beyond Matamoros, with connections to criminal enterprises in Mexico City, Miami, and other major cities. The group had managed to establish a sophisticated drug trafficking network, protected by what many of their associates believed was genuine black magic. Sara Aldrete, known as La Madrina, the godmother, emerged as a particularly interesting figure in the investigation. A former honor student at Texas Southmost College, Aldrete had been living a double life. By day, she was a respected student in Brownsville, Texas. By night, she was Constanzo's high priestess, helping to conduct brutal ritualistic murders. Her transformation from promising student to cult leader became a focal point of public fascination, highlighting how even seemingly normal individuals could be drawn into such extreme behavior. Mexican federal police made their first major breakthrough in the case on April 11, 1989, when they arrested cult member Serafin Hernandez Garcia. Under interrogation, Hernandez provided crucial details about the cult's operations and hierarchy. He described elaborate ceremonies where Constanzo would enter trances, supposedly communicating with spirits to determine who should be sacrificed next. The victims were chosen based on specific criteria: young, healthy individuals who Constanzo believed would provide the most power when sacrificed. The investigation revealed that the cult had developed a precise methodology for their killings. Victims were typically abducted late at night, often from areas where their disappearance wouldn't immediately raise alarms. They were then taken to Rancho Santa Elena, where they would be held in makeshift cells until the time of their sacrifice. The actual killing would take place during elaborate ceremonies, with Constanzo leading his followers in ritual chants while wielding a machete that became known as his sacred blade. Forensic analysis of the ranch continued to yield horrifying discoveries. In addition to the human remains, investigators found detailed journals describing the rituals, lists of potential victims, and evidence suggesting that some of Mexico's most notorious drug traffickers had sought the cult's magical services. The group had effectively created a bizarre niche for themselves in the criminal underworld, where their reputation for brutality and supernatural powers had earned them both fear and respect. The breakthrough in locating Constanzo came on May 6, 1989, when police received a tip about suspicious activity in an apartment building in Mexico City's Cuauhtemoc district. Surveillance teams observed several known cult members entering and leaving the building, and authorities quickly organized a raid. As police closed in, Constanzo realized he was trapped. In his final acts of violence, he ordered one of his followers, Alvaro de Leon Valdez, to shoot him and his lover Martin Quintana Rodriguez rather than face capture. The aftermath of the raid provided even more insights into the cult's operations. The apartment contained numerous ritualistic items, including human bones, blood-stained altars, and detailed instructions for various ceremonies. Perhaps most disturbing were the financial records that showed just how profitable the combination of drug trafficking and supernatural services had been for the group. They had amassed considerable wealth, with bank accounts containing millions of pesos and properties scattered across Mexico. Sara Aldrete was captured shortly after Constanzo's death, attempting to flee Mexico City. During her interrogation, she provided detailed accounts of the cult's activities, though she attempted to minimize her own role, claiming she had been under Constanzo's psychological control. Her testimony, along with that of other captured cult members, painted a picture of how the group had evolved from practicing relatively benign folk magic into committing human sacrifice. The trial of the surviving cult members began in 1989 and drew international attention. The proceedings revealed the full scope of the group's crimes, with evidence suggesting they had killed at least 15 people, though the actual number of victims may have been much higher. The prosecution presented physical evidence, including video recordings of some ceremonies, that left no doubt about the cult's guilt. The impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate investigation and trials. It led to increased scrutiny of religious practices along the border and sparked a broader conversation about the intersection of drug trafficking and occult beliefs. Law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border developed new protocols for investigating cases that might involve ritualistic elements, and the case became a standard study in law enforcement training programs. For the Kilroy family, the resolution of the case brought little comfort. While the killers had been brought to justice, the horrific nature of Mark's death continued to haunt them. They channeled their grief into advocacy, working to improve international cooperation in missing persons cases and supporting other families whose loved ones had disappeared in Mexico. The case also had lasting effects on spring break culture along the Texas-Mexico border. Universities began implementing more stringent safety protocols for students traveling to Mexico, and tourism in Matamoros took years to recover. The event served as a stark reminder that beneath the surface of popular spring break destinations, dangerous criminal enterprises could be operating with impunity. The legal proceedings against the cult members concluded with multiple convictions. Sara Aldrete was sentenced to 62 years in prison, while other members received sentences ranging from 20 to 60 years. The Mexican justice system made it clear that the severity of the sentences was meant to send a message about the consequences of combining drug trafficking with ritualistic murder. In the years following the trials, investigators continued to uncover more details about the cult's operations and influence. Documents found at various properties linked to the group revealed an extensive network of protection that reached into law enforcement and local government. Several officials were eventually implicated in helping the cult operate without interference, either through direct cooperation or by deliberately looking the other way. The case had profound effects on law enforcement training and procedures. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit developed new protocols for investigating crimes with potential occult elements, using the Matamoros case as a primary study. The case highlighted the need for law enforcement to understand how religious beliefs, even extreme ones, could be weaponized by criminal organizations to maintain control and loyalty among their members. Former cult members who served their sentences began to be released in the late 2000s, leading to renewed interest in the case. Their post-prison interviews provided new insights into the psychological manipulation Constanzo had employed. Many described how he would combine genuine religious practices with calculated showmanship, performing seemingly miraculous feats that were actually carefully staged illusions. These demonstrations, combined with the real violence he orchestrated, created an atmosphere of absolute belief among his followers. The Rancho Santa Elena property, where Mark Kilroy and others met their tragic ends, became a grim landmark. Despite efforts to return it to agricultural use, the land remained largely abandoned. Local residents reported that the area felt cursed, and there were occasional reports of people attempting to conduct their own rituals at the site, prompting authorities to increase patrols and security measures. Helen and Jim Kilroy's advocacy work led to several concrete changes in how cross-border missing persons cases are handled. They helped establish protocols for faster information sharing between US and Mexican authorities and pushed for better coordination between law enforcement agencies on both sides of the border. Their efforts resulted in the creation of new databases and communication systems that have helped solve numerous other missing persons cases. The impact on Matamoros itself was long-lasting. The city's economy, heavily dependent on tourism from Texas, took years to recover. Local businesses and government officials worked to reshape the city's image, implementing new security measures and promoting cultural attractions rather than just nightlife. However, the shadow of the case lingered, particularly during spring break season, when news media would often run retrospective pieces about the tragedy. Psychological studies of the case revealed important insights into how criminal organizations can exploit religious beliefs. Experts noted that Constanzo had carefully selected elements from various traditions, Santeria, Palo Mayombe, and indigenous practices, to create a belief system that both terrified and attracted followers. His methods of combination became a template for understanding how other criminal groups might use religious elements to control members. The case also led to increased scrutiny of religious practices along the border region. Legitimate practitioners of Santeria and other Afro-Caribbean religions found themselves having to distance their traditions from the perverted version practiced by the cult. Religious scholars and community leaders worked to educate the public about the differences between authentic spiritual practices and the twisted version employed by Constanzo. Sara Aldrady's case particularly fascinated criminologists and psychologists. Her transformation from honor student to cult leader became the subject of numerous studies on how educated, seemingly well-adjusted individuals can be drawn into extreme behavior. Her prison interviews revealed a complex psychology of denial, rationalization, and lingering loyalty to Constanzo's teachings, even years after his death. The drug trafficking aspect of the case led to changes in how authorities approached cartel investigations. The realization that criminal organizations might be using religious practices as both a control mechanism and a cover for their activities led to more nuanced approaches to infiltration and investigation. Law enforcement began paying more attention to the cultural and religious aspects of criminal organizations, recognizing that understanding these elements was crucial to successful intervention. Mark Kilroy's memory has been preserved through various initiatives. A scholarship in his name was established at the University of Texas, awarded to pre-med students who demonstrate the same commitment to service that Mark had shown. His parents continued to speak at universities and law enforcement conferences, sharing their story to educate others about travel safety and the importance of international cooperation in criminal investigations. The case continues to resonate in popular culture and criminal justice circles. It has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies, each attempting to understand how such extreme beliefs could take root in the modern world. The lessons learned from the investigation have influenced how law enforcement approaches cases involving organized crime, religious elements, and cross-border cooperation. Today, the case serves as a sobering reminder of how vulnerable young people can be when traveling abroad, and how criminal organizations can use belief systems to justify unthinkable acts. The spring break culture that once characterized the Texas-Mexico border region has evolved, with more emphasis on safety and awareness. Universities now provide extensive safety briefings to students planning to travel to Mexico, and the U.S. State Department maintains detailed advisories about potential risks in border areas. The legacy of the case extends beyond its immediate impact on law enforcement and border security. It sparked important discussions about the nature of belief, the power of charismatic leaders, and the ways in which criminal organizations can exploit religious and cultural practices. These conversations continue to influence how we understand and combat organized crime in an increasingly complex world.